collective memory, or the group think or remembering of an idea, concept, etc., is coming up more in the current events, and hence I will speak to at least a somewhat technical definition of collective memory and where that fits in with monuments and memorials and how they're used and what they are intended to represent. So when we're talking about collective memory, it was thought up by a social scientist by the name of Maurice Halbwachs. And his kind of idea was that memories to some extent are synthetic and are passed down, and memories maintain within those collectives a certain kind of weight, which is more or less powerful depending on the connection with that past. So, for example, he believed that grandparents pass on synthetic memories to the grandchildren by nature of his own studies. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because grandma and grandpa tell you all those stories, and then they get stuck in your head. And because you're either younger when they first start telling you to them, or are more in line with events that you weren't alive for, your brain, especially when you're little, comes up with those memories as if they were your own, which we find is more or less true depending on the strength of the memory and how that has affected the individual. But then we look at collective memory, which is much more like how groups of people remember certain things. So collectives are notoriously hard to define. For instance, the collective of Americans, we say, is a very broad group. But then we can look at smaller collectives, such as African American Boy Scouts in the state of Missouri. That's a much smaller collective and much more easy to define, but still you're going to have some individuals who stubbornly refuse to be termed in those groups, right? So you have, if everybody says that the ball went left, you're still going to have that one person that said, well, I think the ball went right. And that's just how collectives work. So monuments, memorials, etc., a lesser set with memorials, but it's still true, are suggesting a specific viewpoint or opinion, not necessarily what we in later years find to be correct. So, for example, World War I didn't have a monument, a really big monument in Washington, D.C. until very recently. And that was what we might define as an important conflict. But only in recent years did we have enough interest to have one actually built, or to get the funding to have one built. There was a smaller one that had kind of been left and it kind of decayed a little bit. It was kind of cool. It's to specifically the people from DC, but it's there. It's hiding. So it's kind of cool. But then you also have now, in more modern discourse, the discussion of Confederate statues. So to understand kind of the purpose of a monument versus a memorial, monuments are more about commemoration of people specifically and less about death, versus a memorial is specifically about people who died normally in some violent conflict. Exceptions possibly being 9/11, which, while violent, wasn't a conflict until after it happened. Or you could have monuments to things like human achievement, such as the moon landing, or the iconic photographs of, for instance, the footprint, the flag, stuff of the moon buggy. Things like this are iconic monuments and that don't exist as like statues, but they're still an argument. They're still pushing a particular way of looking at history. Because as much as historians like to tell history in terms of dates and events that follow in a sequential order, and to some extent these are more or less agreed to, but history is the constant revision due to access to increasingly better material to furnish a more complete understanding of the events that happened. For instance, you look at the Sherman tank, which you see the confirmation bias of people writing things like the book Death Traps, but then you actually look at the primary source documentation from the time, and you see that the Shermans were doing pretty all right and were pretty capable vehicles, and they kind of got lumped in with this Cold War ideology that we had to suggest that the reason we won the war, World War II, was that we were better people, we were more determined, we were braver, and even though our equipment sucked, we managed to keep going. Versus the Soviets, they suck. They've got equipment that sucks, but they got a lot of them. And the Germans have good equipment, but they're not as brave as us. So if we fight the Soviets, we've got bad equipment, but good people, and we've got a lot of good people. Therefore, we will win. And as their equipment improved, they're making different arguments. But that's the general gist of it. The other interesting fact about World War II is, if you notice, just look who wrote the American history of America's official history of the Eastern Front in World War II, and you'll realize, wait, that's the German general that was the commander there. You don't think that's a problem, and that we have to then revise his account because it was him and his buddies writing whatever they wanted. So that's where kind of history is constantly in revision, and memorials and monuments are, to a certain extent, as we believe we have already shown, constantly revised. So monuments generally are making an argument specifically about how something happened, or what should be remembered. For example, if you built a statue of Sitting Bull or Chief Joseph or some other famous Native American, that would be attempting to suggest that to everybody that we need to remember these famous Native Americans because they were, for one reason or another, impressive, right? So then you come to the logical conclusion of that argument, where memorials and monuments are built on a very regular basis for the commemoration of events that we at that time find important, but then are later removed because it turns out these events in the grand scheme of things weren't important. For example, minor differences. The Supreme Court case that was to passed a couple of days ago, the 6-3 decision, while it seems really important and to modern political discourse, in 50 years, I don't think anybody will particularly remember it unless it is being used in commonplace, which is very hard to predict, but as we find unlikely. So, to then, do monuments and memorials ever outlive their usefulness? Well, my capstone on the University of Arizona's monuments should be point enough to say, yes, a lot of them have, because you look at how they're remembered. But then you look at, for example, monuments of the Confederacy built not directly after the war, but during the Jim Crow period, and very prominent public display suggesting that, well, these people were honorable and should be remembered as honorable, versus, say, statues that show the more human side. So these statues in the current, why they're constructed is to make the argument that this was a good thing that should be remembered, and in a positive light. So if you destroy the statue, what you're destroying is more that it should be remembered in a positive light, not the history of the statue itself, which is a complicated argument because it relies on a more nuanced understanding of what history is, which people don't like because it's not simple. So if, for instance, you put on every statue of Jefferson Davis the sign traitor, is that correct? Yes. Well, but people don't like that because it's portraying it in a negative light. And that's what they are really concerned about with their history, open in air quotes, being defined as negative. Obviously, heritage can be easily remembered in history books. And if your argument is, well, we just want to preserve history, well, I hate to break it to you, but history, as I've already said, is under constant revision. So good luck with that. But more to the point, if your argument is more even the fundamental of history, that or the what is thought of as history, that is a sequence of events in a chronological order, then, well, we've got you covered. Don't worry, there are plenty of books, and they all also say that the South turned against the North, and to some extent, this is still taught and properly in a lot of places, because they call it the War of Northern Aggression or the war between the states, and there's a very specific reason why those terms were come up with, and it's to shift blame. Because obviously no one wants to be responsible for a war. That's kind of like inherent. No one wants to be like, we're the reason 500,000 people died, and we're proud of that. No, it's just not generally the point. Omissions generally also of different historical events will come up on political sides representing either side of the argument. For instance, the cornerstone speech and the design notes for the battle flag of the Confederacy often are omitted. But then you have on the other side, very real individuals who did publish some very inflammatory things that made their way to the South, for instance, killing all the slave owners. So while the blame is still theirs, they were not totally, the North, we would say, is not totally without its share of inflammatory materials. However, they still did not fire first, which is what in turn starts a war. So again, that's where the omission and then the chronological events, and you can look at the organization of Southern militias and why they happen in response to John Brown, and so the fears were real. They also just didn't like the fact that they to some extent had lost control of the House, which had been set up as their house of government, while the Senate was further north, and so there's also that. And you can look at plantation tours. There's some great articles about them and why they omit slavery or have done funny things to slave cabins and different things like that, because generally it's not viewed as acceptable or tolerable or nice, and therefore is omitted. And then if you omit it, you don't have to talk about a very complex and painful issue that is generally viewed as wrong in the current time period, which then doesn't get people to show up to the plantation, and therefore no plantation tours. So there's a little bit of that. There's a side note on plantation tours, which and they are a monument, by the way, is interesting. Is there's the Mammy character in Gone with the Wind, and then in plantation tours, there's no historical backing for this term ever existing at a plantation for that character, or caricature, I should say. But the general idea of Mammy is then transformed. So people expect, well, is this where Mammy lived? And you see like references, the few references there are to slavery in these plantation tours, you'll see like Mammy lived here or the Mammy lived here. And that there's just no evidence to support that a Mammy character ever existed. In fact, there's a lot of evidence against that suggestion. So that's the revision of a memory and of a viewpoint that becomes part of a collective memory. Is it what we would call formal history? Well, no, but it's interesting nonetheless. But in general, you see a lot of revision for all over the world. For instance, in California and in the South, there still is a chain called Sambo's, which is based on a The name comes from a Indian, i.e., a subcontinent of Asia, fairy tale about a boy, and yet their image representing this boy was a negative caricature of a African American, which is wrong for a variety of reasons. But that is how you get like the change, and now you can see Sambos is just either the word, or now having seen a coloring book with the general images of the actual story on it at one of these locations, I would say that they have then more so moved to what also might be termed as more authentic, but there's a lot of danger and what is authentic, and that's a whole discussion for a later date. Representation of the story and of the character. So that's that. Is revision always good? Well, no. You can make an argument that editing things like these monuments would be a better way to remember that these things did happen. I would say it would be a bad argument. I would not support it, but there is at least a little bit of a cogent argument. It's not what's being made on the news or why people say, "Oh, it's our history. We need to preserve it." That's functionally irrelevant. But the general concerns of persons is much more about the viewpoint, again, political. And it's at the current time, as well as the political view that this monument was designed to create in the past. So you also look in U.S. history, and you'll see a very interesting thing with monuments, and it's like right before some 1980s and 90s, you have a huge rush of monuments being built because it's about to not only be a new century, but a new millennia. Ooh, arbitrary dates are cool. So you just look at the Julian calendar or the Japanese calendar or the Islamic calendar, and they'll say it wasn't a new millennia. But in this we digress. So the concept of this monument rush, then we look back and we say, well, it happened in the 1880s and 1890s as well. And you're like, huh? And then you see, like this fairly recent concept of what a monument is. Not that monuments haven't always existed. No shit, there were always big statues of Caesars and things like that. But more of the modern concept of using them not for a conquered people's in the capital of, like, say, Rome, but more spread out, more dispersed, and more like the European style. I'm talking much more about American monumentation and memorialization that has existed. So that's kind of also a thing. The monuments that we have, for example, from 9/11, what's the political message there? We were attacked, and we were then justified. Now, it's a great memorial. It's a great monument, because it's both, turns out. And it illustrates that point very well, and nobody can disagree with it, either historically or politically. But we still find that the relationship with that monument memorial, because, well, it's both, is much more complicated than at first it might appear. Because if you ask people, well, then should we have invaded Iraq? Well, they'll say no, and because Iraq had nothing to do with it, which is also true. But people then don't realize that the invasion of Iraq, 9/11, was justified by the New York Times doing a lot of yellow journalism to support the idea of invasion, and the article that suggested that Iraq had not dismembered its nuclear program appeared on the anniversary of 9/11 next to the full page, well, not entirely full page, very large ads about remembering 9/11 and stories about remembering 9/11. And we don't like to then admit that those memories are conjoined, because even though Iraq had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks, our memory and our collective decided, well, really it did. And that's a view, which is collective memory being modified for current events. So we were attacked by a Eastern nation, obviously Afghanistan is much more Central Asia than it is Middle Eastern. So that's also where collective memory kind of becomes screwy, because people think it's in the Middle East, which is, while the Middle East is a vernacular region, not a functional or nodal region, it most definitely does not go all the way to Afghanistan. That's a little bit too far. And then you have the actual view of who was more directly involved, which is Saudi Arabia. Obviously, we didn't invade them. And then you also have the invasion of Afghanistan, which was because we wanted to go and blow up the camps where these people had been trained. And then the government of the time, now obviously defunct, the Taliban, said, no, you can't destroy these Al-Qaeda camps. We want to maintain our relationship with them. And we said, fuck you, and invaded, because we get to do that when you're the superpower and world police. Yes. So the general viewpoint, therefore, linked with that 9/11 monument is then justification. And in 100 years, you might say, well, this event was terrible, but this monument has been used monument memorial has been used to represent that this war was okay. And so while that that also has the tenets of a memorial, we find then that will probably be an example in which there could be modifications made to say, well, it was a tragedy that these people died. We at that time were not justified. I'm not making an argument that we are or we're not. I'm just saying what it is at the current moment versus what it could be, not what it will be, which is, again, very hard to predict. And I'm just making a theoretical point. So, yes. Now, obviously, memorials come under a lot of more revision than a lot less revision than monuments, because, well, a memorial is about specific individuals who died, ergo, it is much more viewed as generally disrespectful to tear one down. No one is ever going to go after in a serious political way, the graves of Confederate soldiers, because that one is just what we would view as unacceptable, because you do not disturb the dead. And there's also this cute little phrase in Latin called memento mori. So it means remember that you must die, but it also relates to remember the dead, which people don't like because it's not properly conjugated and they can't read between the lines. And again, the collective has changed what that word means. So that's kind of the thing. So that's also an interesting point, is you recognize that. So the correct Latin for remember the dead would be memento morisus. So that's the proper conjugation. But memento mori specifically means you remember that you too will die. But then we see it attached to all these monuments, and therefore it has become a way of remembering monuments and memorialization, which is also a little different of an issue. That we don't like really to talk about because it's complicated, and complications make life harder. So yes, that's generally the point of why monuments and memorials are built. I'm sorry that it did sometimes stray a little bit from that. What makes photographs into memorials or monuments, or what makes them iconic, is a discussion that I could dive into at a later point. I won't go too far into it right now. I didn't go too far into it. However, I can see some people being interested and listening to why that is. So yes, that's cool, I think. This has been the Webo Bubble, and this has been my podcast. Thank you very much.